So our presentation today is on hours of service for local governments, and specifically pertaining to people with CDLs who are driving commercial motor vehicles. This is an interesting subject. It's complicated. DOT is a really complicated subject. As I was preparing for this presentation, my mind got twisted in knots more than a couple of times, trying to remember where everything went, and I thought, this is a challenge for me to try to present this in a quick, concise way to you. Because it is a really challenging subject. DOT has a ton of regulations, and they're all quite complex. I'm not even going to attempt to explain the vast majority of those things. We're going to really focus on the hours of service thing, but just suffice it to say that we are talking about people driving with a commercial driver's license, and they're also driving a commercial motor vehicle. And the standard things on that: more than 10,001 pounds. It is placarded or is carrying hazardous materials in placardable quantities. Boy, I'm struggling a little bit here today. And the other things are if they're carrying passengers for hire. Anyway, with this subject, it has come up, hours of service has come up a lot lately, particularly in regards to snowplow operations. We've had a little more typical Utah rough winter where we've had our snowplow operators out there in some cases for a lot of hours to try to keep up with these storms. One recent storm just seemed like it just kept giving for many days, and then it got cold, and it was a real challenge. So we had ice and all of those things. It was a hard thing, and we try to respond when we get massive questions around a certain subject. We'll try to respond because we know it's not just those people that have the question. So that's why today we want to talk about the basics of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. FMCSA is the division of the Department of Transportation that regulates this area, and we want to talk about that, how it specifically applies to local government agencies and snowplow operations in particular. All right, so why are we here? Well, we're spending time talking about regulations. We're talking about compliance and all of those things. But the reality is we're really here for safety. These regulations are based around having safe drivers out there on the road. And one major goal of that is to keep fatigued drivers off the road. If people are not alert, if they are fatigued and not ready to work, like Mike was talking about in his presentation today, we could have serious accidents. And when we're talking commercial motor vehicles, snow plows, those accidents could be catastrophic. And so we definitely want to focus some attention on that. And so our goal here today is really for the safety of the operators and for the rest of us that are out there on the road. Okay, so we talked. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, establishes rules for commercial motor vehicle transportation. And you may be familiar with those. The drug screen regulations are in there, the randoms, the driver qualification requirements, the medical cards, and all of those things that you deal with. And like I said, we're not going into all of those details. We're talking about the hours of service requirements. And what they in general require a driver to do is to track their driving, the hours in which they're driving, the hours in which they're on shift, their breaks, and the various parts of their day to ensure that they don't exceed too many hours and then become fatigued in their driving and maybe have an accident. This has had significant changes in recent years, and some of us may not have really kept up on those because a lot of these changes took place through the COVID years, just prior to that, but we may not have been totally caught up on it. So we wanted to give you an overview of what the requirements are. Well, so here's a question for you. Can you keep track of 4 clocks simultaneously? I know there's 5, but that's the graphic I had. Can you keep track of 4 clocks? Because that's really what the requirement is in the hours of service regulation. There's a brake clock, driving clock, a shift clock, and a cycle clock. And we'll talk about what each one of these is and what the requirements are around those. But there are these 4 simultaneous clocks that are running. They may start and start and stop, and they're not the same. They have different requirements. So let's dive in. But there are a couple of basics that we want to talk about. Now, in this transportation, DOT transportation, we have one difference that makes a substantive difference in these requirements, and that's whether we're carrying property. So we're hauling equipment, salt, whatever it may be that is property, versus passengers. So if I'm driving a bus and I was just going to leave all the passenger transport out, and then I thought, no, we have a significant number of trust members out there that actually do transit and transport. And so there's a difference in here, and I will try to make sure that we call those out whenever we see those. But property versus passenger is an important designation. So just think about what your operations are and what you do. The other thing are the days of operation. Do we work 7 days a week? Do we work 365 days a year? Because there's a difference between that. If our operations are like an over-the-road carrier, so I have a big trucking company that's shipping stuff all the time, everywhere, that my operation would be a 7-day a week, or we would use an 8-day schedule for that. If I'm not 7 days a week, then I'm going to use a different schedule. So we're going to talk 8 days versus a 7-day cycle as we go through this. So just keep that in the back of your mind. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense right now. There are some changes one of the changes was mandatory breaks, and when we have to take a break, and that's just to look forward a little bit, that's after at least within 8 hours. Okay. And other things, no driving after 14 or 15. So remember that property versus passenger. 14 is for property, 15 is for passengers. So no driving after that many hours on shift. And that's not just driving. So when I'm on shift, I can be doing other things besides driving. I can be loading up. I can be working on my paperwork. I can be doing things that don't specifically involve driving. But that 14 hours is still clicking. That clock is running from the time I show up at work until I finish my shift and I'm off. All right, so let's talk about these 4 specific clocks. That break clock, this one's the easiest one. I need to have a 30-minute break within an 8-hour time frame. So, and I put in here before 8 hours to maintain compliance. I want to make sure I've covered that within those 8 hours. Now, a lot of these regulations really pertain to those over-the-road drivers that are putting in hours and hours driving. They're written more so for those people. Most of us here think of 8 hours of driving, and then I get a bathroom break for 30 minutes. That's a pretty long stretch there. Well, if we're in those over-the-road type situations, well, that's the requirement that I have. So 30-minute break, and this is something that has to be totally away from my duties. I can't be in filling out logbooks and doing work type things and count that as my 30-minute break. This needs to be a meal break, bathroom break, things where I'm aside from work duties. Okay, and you want to think about that. When I take that 30-minute break, if I take it within the first couple of hours of my shift, I may end up taking another one later on. So guys that are trying to maximize the amount of time that they have on the road are planning these breaks accordingly. Okay, the next one is our drive clock, and this gives us the maximum number of hours that I can drive during my shift. And there's more to it than just this, but in general, if I'm carrying property, the maximum number of hours I can drive is 11. If I'm carrying passengers, the maximum number of hours I can drive is 10. Now, we talked before on that previous slide that there are 14 or 15-hour shifts that I have to keep track of, right, during my day. But of that day, only 11 or 10 hours, depending on what I'm carrying, of those hours can be done driving. Okay. All right. And Mike, I know there may be a lot of questions on this, but feel free to stop me. I just looked at the chat and I see numbers there. Is there anything I need to take care of now? I don't know if you're muted.
Sorry, I couldn't get off mute. No, we're good. We're good. There's a question about if lunch counts for the break.
Oh, yeah. So that is a good question. If it's a meal break, yes, you can do that 30-minute break as your lunch break. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, it just has to be a complete break from work duties, right?
Correct.
So it's not like eating your Big Mac while you're driving. No, that doesn't work.
Okay. Then we have our shift. And that is the 14 or 15-hour number that we talked about. And what that means is I can't do any driving, even if I haven't driven during that time. If I've been on 14 hours or 15, if I'm carrying passengers, I can't drive beyond that time. Now, that doesn't preclude me from doing more work, but it may be a problem with the next clock, that cycle clock that I have. So just remember, no driving after 14 or 15 hours on shift. And so I have to be able to track when I start and when I go off. Now, all of this begins after I have had a break. And so that clock starts, well, let's see, the cycle clocks, yeah, the shift clock starts after I have had 10 consecutive hours off duty if I'm carrying property, or 8 hours if I'm carrying passengers. I'm sorry about that. That's I think it's silly to make a distinction. I think it all should be the same. That's my opinion, but these are the regulations. So I have to have at least 10 hours off, no work duties, to reset that. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind on this is these work duties are not, so this is as a driver, these work duties are not just with your employer that you're talking about. You may have a moonlight job where you're doing some other work. If I'm doing work duties there for another employer, I got to count those too. And so keep that in mind. If I'm tracking my work hours in this shift clock, I got to track all of those things. If I'm busy working, whatever it may be, I may be running a forklift or something else. Those are still shift hours, and they count towards my 14-hour clock or 15-hour clock. And then this last one.
And this counts plowing snow as well, right? Plowing snow plays into this.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. We're going to talk specifically about that. Your cycle clock. This is your week, is what you can think about. But it's not just Monday to Sunday. This is a rolling 7 or 8 day cycle. Okay, we talked about that. There's a difference there. If you're on an 8-day cycle, that's if your employer is running every day of the year, or 7 days a week. If you're working less than that, which most of our local government agencies would be, you're working 5 days, and then if we have bad weather, we may do overtime on the weekends, but in general, we're not running 7 days a week. So we would be on a 60-hour cycle. And what this means is once I reach that 60 hours within those 7 rolling days, I'm off. I can't reset that until I drop 1 day off and I get some more hours that I can run, or I can reset the entire clock if I take 34 hours off. So this is basically your weekend, close to a day and a half. I can reset that cycle clock if I have that many hours off in a row. Now, if I start messing around and I end up partway through those 34 hours, I have to go and push push snow, or I have to go and do a job for a couple of hours. Well, then I got a problem. I'm going to start that 34-hour clock again. Now, let's back up just a little bit. I said we've got a 60-hour cycle in 7 days. Well, let's say I'm at my 60 hours and I've got to be off work. So I take off work. I go 10 hours, or 8 if you're carrying passengers. I go 10 hours that I'm off. And then when I start again, I've dropped off the first day of those last 7 day cycle, of that last 7 day cycle. How many hours did I drop off? Well, if I dropped off 10 hours, I've got 10 hours that I can add back into that overall cycle. And just to go along with this, if you're on an 8-day, 70-hour cycle, it's the same thing. It's just 8 days and 70 hours versus 7 days and 60 hours. I'm sure there will be some questions on this one. Is there anything that we really need to answer right now, Mike?
Nope, there's no questions right now.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't click the button on that one. There you go. I was looking at this other page. So you can see what those rules are. Additionally, with this regulation, there is a requirement to log your hours. And so you've heard about all the way back to Convoy by I lost his name. There's a quiz for you. Who can name the singer of the song Convoy from back in the 70s? Mike, you got to let me know as soon as somebody puts that in. I've lost it in the back of my head. But in the song Convoy, he talked about we left the swindle sheets on the scales. Well, what they're talking about here are the log books. In the old days, people would run a dual pair of log books, and so they could drive extra hours. Well, that's changed over time. If you are a carrier working for one of these big companies, you'll have an ELD, or electronic logging device, that you track your hours in. Some of these are tied to GPS systems, and it's just automatic. And it can be downloaded by your employer. It can also be audited by state and federal DOT agencies to see if you're complying with your electronic logging and with your hours of service. Now, for those of us who may be not running like that, a carrier, it's just an occasional excursion where we go out beyond 150 air miles. Well, then we may use a logbook. If you're within that 150 air mile, so 150 air miles in a circle all the way around, if I'm staying within that, there's an exception around that. I may be able to just track my hours. However, I would give you a word of caution on this. If you need to cross port of entry, you're going to be going over scales. I would maintain a logbook. I think that would be much easier to prove your compliance. And avoid any problems when you hit the port. Now, those of you that are regularly doing that may want to comment on there of exactly what UDOT wants to see when you're here locally. But the majority of us are not going to be crossing scales. But I do know, folks in my neck of the woods up in Cache County may be driving periodically to come and get loads of salt. They take a semi and they drive down to Tooele County to load up salt, or maybe somewhere else, Redmond. And so they're crossing scales to do that, or going through a port. That would be someplace that I would be concerned about making sure that we've got those all up to date. Now, otherwise, we can just track our hours, keep a list there, and maintain those hours. Okay, there are a couple. Mike, if you need to jump in, go ahead.
I was just going to tell you, it's C.W. McCall.
C.W. McCall. I knew. I totally lost it there. Did you?
Vernal City, Jeremy Garlick, Seth. They all.
All right. Good deal.
There's a question about scales. Do we need to go across the scales with the X plates?
That is a great question. And the answer that that I have gotten is yes. Now, I did not talk to UDOT about that. So maybe somebody that's regularly doing that would like to chime in, but I do know that most people that I've discussed that with, they do stop at the scales. Okay. So logging your hours. There are some exceptions that are in this. We talked about the 150 air miles. There are other things like an adverse weather exception. If you have some weather conditions that happen that you could not have planned for, you can add an additional 2 hours to your time. So basically, if I'm coming across Wyoming and I get caught in a blizzard there and it slows me down and it takes me 2 hours to get to a place where I can stay or to my destination, I can add those additional 2 hours. But if it's something that I could have planned for, if I-80 was already closed or already had major restrictions, UDOT's going to look at that, or WDOT, whoever the transportation agency over it, they'll look at that and say, well, you could have planned this. We already had restrictions on I-80. You knew that it was going to be slow, so you should have built that into your plan. There's also a non-CDL exception if I'm driving a vehicle that is not required to have a CDL operator. Then there's exception to tracking my hours of service there. Okay, now I know everybody's going, wow, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things here. Let's talk specifically about the question that's already come up. What about snowplow operations? How do I deal with this when we have a major winter storm and it's causing, and please don't do this. Please don't put people's garbage cans away for them. How do I ensure, so what about snowplow operations? How do I ensure that our drivers are safe, that we're keeping the rules, we're compliant, and all of those things? And what about that? Well, this is the point where you're going to accuse me of a bait and switch. And it kind of is in a way, because I wanted to get through the hours of service requirements to start with. So before we talked about this slide right here. So we really understood what those requirements are. But here in the federal regulation is an exception. It says, unless otherwise specifically provided, the rules in this subchapter do not apply, and this is the hours of service, do not apply to transportation performed by the federal government, a state, or any political subdivision of a state. Now, some of you out there just went, some of you are mad at me right now because I put you through that mental exercise to think about hours of service. And some of you are just going, what? What did he just say? Well, what this says is that we have an exception to the rule. So if we are snowplowing, if we are operating as a governmental agency, we don't have the requirement to follow the hours of service rules. Now, some of you are saying, yippee, this is awesome. But I have to say, but. What's the big but? Pee Wee Herman said, everybody's got a big butt. And I think he's correct on this one. At least I do this today. There's a big but about this. How do we keep people safe? We don't want to rely on exception when people's lives are on the line, especially if somebody dies, right? If we've had an accident, I really don't want to be going out there saying, I didn't have to follow this because, and I know our driver's been driving for 24 hours straight and he fell asleep and he killed somebody. I don't want to try to rely on an exception for that. So here is the message to our for this webinar and what we really want to get out of this. how do we ensure driver safety without hours of service? How do we ensure that we're able to keep those drivers safe? And I want to outline a few things and also some information that that UDOT has prepared on this. So here's a few things that I would throw out to you. So managing your driver hours, we want to be realistic and honest about our capabilities, about our shifts. Do we have enough qualified CDL operators to do what we need to do? If we don't, we need to have an honest conversation with the powers that be, whoever the governing body is for your organization. If we're severely out of we would be out of compliance with the hours of service rules by the way we're doing things, well, we need to have a conversation about staffing levels and hiring the appropriate people, or some other things that I'll talk about in a minute. But we need to be serious about our weaknesses. Are drivers capable to do the type of work that we have? Some jobs, pushing snow, are a lot harder than others. And so do we have the depth that we need in those really challenging areas? And then we need to build a program around that. And let's base that on our regular day driving, and then also the extreme cases. We know that we're going to occasionally get into a storm cycle that's going to go on for 2 or 3 days. And that's really going to push our resources. And so how do we handle that versus a regular week in the life? How do we ensure that we've got the right people? Well, let me talk about some material that I found that UDOT did. It was a study that they did back in 2015. And the report came out in 2016. And this is really a great report. And I will send that out. It's a PDF, and I'll send it out to everybody who signed up for this webinar today. And it calls out a lot of research that they did. They polled 39 state agencies that are doing this type of work. 39 meaning the other 11 probably don't have significant snow operations, or they didn't respond. They did this with the purpose of trying to reduce fatigue. Of course, UDOT has more snowplow operations, drivers, operators than anybody else in the state. They have more exposure. I saw some statistics last week of the number of miles that they've already put on this year plowing snow, and it was just an incredible number of miles. And so they have major risk there. And so they paid for this study. Now, it was another group that went out and brought all this information in, and they paired it with what they had from the UDOT angle. And really they found a few things that were important. They found that when you look at an operator, the duration of driving is really less important than the time of day that they're driving, the time that they're awake, and what their previous sleep was. Did they have a good rest the night before? They may be able to operate more hours if they had good rest. And so some things like that time off in between shifts is as important or more important than the number of hours in which somebody drives. Other things that they found were that safety risks are compounded by the interaction of factors in the workplace, right? The working conditions, environmental conditions. So a shorter shift in a high stress environment, it's dark and it's a nasty storm that's out there, and whatever those stressors and fatigues that go into it, maybe that shorter shift may be more dangerous than a longer shift in an environment that's much easier. All right, so I just want to run through what this research showed and some things that I would recommend that you take into account in building your program around snowplow operations in particular, because those are the ones that really push our limits on the hours. Their recommendation was really not to go beyond 12 hours, only in really extended conditions should we ever go beyond 12 hours. My recommendation is on this, let's start with the hours of service. We know 11 hours or 10 hours, but generally that 11 hours for snowplow operations would be the limit. I really don't want to be beyond that. Now, UDOT said, well, 12 hours is kind of that limit where we should be at, realizing that we can have extreme conditions that may cause us to extend hours a bit. Nobody should ever be driving 18, 20, 24 hours. That's just where at the point where we're being negligent. Time between shifts, remember how critical that is. What were the hours of service? I need at least 8 or 10, but it's 10 when it comes down to carrying property, 10 hours between shifts. So telling somebody, yeah, go get a couple hours sleep and then jump back in the truck, that's probably not going to be anywhere near enough rest for that person. They need that break from the stress, from what that brings on. It's a stressful job to do those things. Allow them to have breaks during their shift. Skipped one there. Allow them to have breaks during their shift so they can get out of the truck for a half hour and have that micro nap, have a meal, and allow their mind to wind down a little bit during that time and be able to get the rest that will help them focus during that time. Consider altering the shift start times. What they found in this study was that nighttime driving produced a lot more, and snow plowing in particular, produced a lot more incidents than driving during the day. And what their recommendation is can we alter when our shifts start and stop so we don't have one shift that does the graveyard shift and they've got the real high risk shift all of the time. And so rotation of those shifts may be a big part of our program. I'm looking at staffing. One thing that UDOT does, and I know this one from personal experience because my son worked for UDOT for a time and then he took another job. Well, UDOT called him back and said, hey, we'd like to have you as an on-call driver. And so if we have a storm on the weekend or we get into a situation where it's an extended storm where we're going to be putting our drivers beyond the hours they should be driving, we would like to call you in as another driver. I think this is a great practice. You know, here was my son. He's a good driver. And he has his CDL, he maintains his medical card and all of those things. He's in a random pool and all of those things to be a good CDL operator. And he's willing to go out and push snow on the weekend. So that is something that you may consider. You may have some people who have retired from your organization who were really good operators, and they've gone past that 1 year. Make sure we don't mess up their retirement, but they've had that 1 year separation, but they're still maintaining their CDL. They're good drivers. They're healthy, and all of that. They can do the job. Well, let's pay them. Let's get them to come in as an on-call or a seasonal driver to help us out. That in my mind is a great way to give our folks a break while still providing the level of service that our communities have come to expect. We'll talk about that more in just a second. Rotating drivers, we talked about that. You know, good rotation, giving them rest periods, and also rotate their areas of responsibility. So one person is not doing that long shift in the canyon after dark. So we rotate them out. So everybody gets a little bit of the bad, but we all end up a little better at the end of the day. One other recommendation they had was to deploy all of your resources at an outset of a storm. Let's just pound this to start with. When we get that first big hit of snow, let's throw all of our resources at it and then rotate our people out as we go along. So we get ahead of the storm when we initially start, and then we can rotate our people out, get them rest, and while keeping a certain level of service there. And one other thing they threw into here, which sometimes is met with a little bit of criticism from the public, we may consider reducing the level of service that we give during extreme storms. Now, I know that's something that takes a lot broader discussion, but as I was growing up and we would go into Idaho, and it's still this way in some places, they have gates across certain roads, particularly going over passes and canyons, and they close the gate and they say, we're not pushing snow until tomorrow morning, or and I know that's something that may not be palatable in a lot of our jurisdictions there. We got to get people home and all of those things, but if we have that ability to say, hey, we're beyond what we can do with our folks, let's think about what we can do with our level of service. All right, I don't want to end on that one because I know that's one of those things. Major focus of this, let's focus on our people. Let's think about how do we keep them alert, refreshed, and give them the amount of breaks and limit the amount of time that they're driving. We don't have to follow the hours of service regulations, but let's emulate those as much as we possibly can. So just in summary on here, take a real honest look at your operations and say, are we even in the ballpark? If you're not, then we may need to consider hiring other people or getting additional resources to do that. If we're just on the edge, well, let's look at some of these suggestions and see, hey, could we bring on a on-call or a seasonal driver or 2 or 6 to help us out? Be flexible in our program. Don't be so rigid in shifts and things like that we put people at risk. And the overall goal here is to keep our operators safe out there, and as well as the rest of us out on the road. Okay, that was a lot of stuff, folks. If you got questions or comments, type them into the chat box. I see the number 15 on the chats. How many of those do I have to answer to, and how many people are mad at me now?
None. Everyone's talking about C.W. McCall. No.
Oh, C.W. McCall. That was. What is your favorite C.W. McCall song? Now that'll get them talking in the chat box. Now,
that was great. I mean, a lot of information there. Thanks for putting that together. That's fantastic.
Convoy was a good song, but CJ5 4-wheel drive got a smoky on my tail. I can't remember what the title of the song. That was my favorite of C.W. McCall's. All right. Were there any questions that we need to answer, Mike?
I don't have no questions right now. So folks, if you got a question, type it in here to the chat. We'll stump the Jason and see what we can do.
It won't take much on this one today. This is a tough subject. It's important. And I would love to have a discussion with you about this. If you have something you want to specifically talk about this, the direction you're going in your program, let us know. And I was going to throw some statistics in here to start with. We've had a lot of snowplow involved incidents in the last, since October, and it's in the dozens. And most of them are fairly minor. There'll be a backing crash, or somebody will slide in or slide into a car, or they'll knock a mailbox over. Those types of claims that we see come in. But because of the equipment that we're dealing with, this is serious business, and we want to make sure that we're taking it seriously. So love to talk to you about that. Let's keep the drivers on our minds, and let's keep them safe out there.
So question here. Someone has said that snow plowing within a city limits as a city staff did not require a CDL.
Yeah. And there's another exception for that. And I would just go back to what I said there. I don't want to rely on an exception in those situations, particularly if we're talking 10-wheelers. If you've got somebody that's pushing in a pickup that may exceed that 10,000 pounds, well, that might be something that we consider. We have a lot of those, the 1-ton pickups, or even a little bigger than 1 tons that we use to clear parking lots. That may be somewhere you consider that. But if you're pushing with true commercial motor vehicles, I would stay away from that exception. That would be the rule I would go by, and there may be an exception here or there. Okay. All right. Mike's looking intently there. We're all good?
Yeah, I was just looking at the chat. He just put a thumbs up sign.
Folks, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. If you're mad at me, give me a call. If you want to discuss it, give me a call, and we'd be happy to help out. Like I said, I'll send the UDOT material out and a copy of the slides for you, so you can look at that. Oh, and one other thing that I totally spaced off talking about, we have a lot of resources just on the other DOT things. Our Streamery application. We have dozens of DOT related, whether it's pre-trip inspections or a whole variety of things. They have specific things on garbage collection operations, and you name it, 1, 2, 3. There are a ton of those available, and this is a free service to you as a member of the trust. And all you have to do is send Mike an email. You can send me an email too. My webinar, I can throw it on Mike. Mike, I'll take it. Yeah. Mike at utahtrust.gov or Jason at utahtrust.gov, and we'll send you out your username, and the password's super easy as well. And we'll send you that, and you can stream away. There's no cost for that at all. And so for those other things, we've got a lot of resources there. All right. I saw numbers go up. Anything I need to cover before we wrap?
Nope. Lots of thank yous.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate it. Appreciate all of your attention here and your efforts to keep us safe out there. Go out and have a safe day.
Thanks, everyone.